and how it can be useful for carers. Today we've got sharing with us Daniel Giles, who's going to talk about the local area coordination. Danny's the neighbourhood manager for Derby City Council, so he may talk a little bit about his own role, about local coordination and how we can access that. But I'll hand over straight to him, and we may have some questions throughout or at the end.
Thanks, Nikki. So just to say up front as well, apologies if I'm clearing my throat a little bit. It's that time of the year for me where I have allergies kicking in. My 38-week pregnant wife, I think at times, is about ready to throttle me. So apologies if I'm clearing my throat somewhat. I'm also working from home, and I have a 4-year-old cockapoo who is a trained security dog, it seems. So if you hear suddenly a random load of barks that just suddenly take place, it all is probably absolutely well. He just barks at various things occasionally. So my name's Danny. I'm Danny Giles. I am a neighbourhood manager for Derby City Council. I'm going to share a presentation, but I thought I'd just introduce myself essentially first. I used to be a local area coordinator for around about 3.5 years. I've now moved into the neighbourhood managing role. There are 5 neighbourhood managers across the city that cover the 5 localities in the city. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. I was previously, as I say, in LAC for about 3.5 years. I was based in the Blaygreaves ward area, which as an area is quite, there are more older adults living within that area. So there's around about 25 to 30% more, or 25 to 30%, which is about 5 to 10% more than the Derby average for individuals aged 65 and over, as an example. But in particular, with regard to carers, there's actually around about 2% more unpaid carers in that ward, and in the wards that I now manage, and those wards are Blaygreaves, Little Over, and Mickleover. Hence why I had an interest actually in probably delivering in this group, and having this opportunity. So thank you as well for that, Nikki and Alice. So I'll share the presentation now. And all being well, there'll be no technical glitch or any issue. I'm hoping everybody can see that, but I'm going to assume yes, unless somebody says otherwise. So I'm going to start cracking on. If you see me occasionally looking to the side here, it's because I've got an extra screen. So as a quick description of local area coordination, I'll give a bit of history on it first, actually. So it originally started in really the 70s or 80s in Australia, and it was quite a big thing there because Australia, for anyone that doesn't know much about Australia, it's quite a big, large chunk of land out there, and there are various pockets of villages and cities and towns that are pretty much in the middle of nowhere, with essentially only neighbours and the odd bit of services to support. So bringing in what is the idea of local area coordination suited them down to the ground, because the basis of it is around supporting individuals to essentially create their own good life, consider those around them as a network of support, something that often many will call social capital. So it could be family, friends, support services, and various other organisations that might support them, whilst taking into consideration their own strengths and skills and assets that they can do to support them, almost from that welfare state as opposed to a business, let's say. So welfare state being that the local government in the area would be essentially trying to support people to live more independently, as opposed to being dependent on the services within that system. In terms of local area coordinators, we have 21 based in our city. So that's 18 that cover the 18 wards in Derby City. We have 1 based in the hospital discharge unit and emergency department team as well within the Derby Royal. It's actually 19, let's say. And then we also have an additional LAC, I'll call them for shorter, that's also based in South Derbyshire. And she covers Hilton, Melbourne and Wellington in particular. That also essentially covers Mercia Marina. And I might end up talking a little bit about that particular area later. We then also have an additional LAC that covers the city centre with parts of Abbey as well. So just to give a bit of a makeup in terms of our coverage. So we have full city coverage as a team, and there's a good number. LAC in Derby really began about 12 to 13 years ago. It started with 2 or 3 local area coordinators getting started, and they mainly picked areas such as Arboreton and Alveston as they were areas of higher deprivation. But because of the success of the model of work and the style of work and the supporting community, it's kind of branched out further, and we now, as a whole team, cover the entire city. Mentioning obviously 21 local area coordinators in the 18 wards. I referenced earlier that I'm one of 5 neighbourhood managers covering 5 localities. So all of those local area coordinators are kind of branched out into certain teams. So as I say, I already mentioned that I manage Blaegreaves, Littleover and Mickleover. Within that team, we have 3 LACs, one of which is my colleague Nadine, who's with me here today. And Nadine works in the area of Mickleover, but we're fortunate in our team in that we also have our colleague Raj, who is based at the hospital, and our colleague Charlotte in terms of our team that's based in the South Derbyshire area. The main idea there being that because we have full city coverage and because we have managers covering the areas and because we are able to speak with one another and be based in local communities, we get to know the local communities at ward levels as opposed to trying to cover a wider space. In terms of the background on local area coordination, so the main idea is that communities often aren't actually that welcoming. There aren't often things for people to do. There are often situations or issues for people that make communities actually quite exclusive, not very inclusive at all in some examples, especially when you consider the kind of digital age that we've been moving into for the last 20, 30 years. And it makes accessing the right information at the right time for people extremely hard. If you're not somebody that's tech savvy or knows where to go to get information or knows who to contact to then find out where to go, it becomes extremely hard for individuals, which, be it for a carer or someone being cared for, can be extremely hard when you're in that situation and you need maybe a little bit of information to, whether it be, I'll use it in this example here, to find out whether there's some form of benefit that should be provided for you or the individual, or a local group, support group for you or the individual, or just some information around what may be their condition or your condition as well in terms of supporting them. It's really important things, essentially, having that access to information. It can be hard for people who are perceived as vulnerable to be part of or contribute to their local community for all the reasons that I've listed above. Because if you don't have access to information, if it's hard to get to somewhere because it's not very accessible to you, be it physically, geographically, or as I say, because it's online, then that creates an awful lot of problems. And very quickly, you then start to have social isolation becoming a topic of conversation, which certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, if it wasn't already, it has become more so. Many often drawing that down to COVID as well, adding an additional factor into that. So when you start to consider things like that, it really does make it really hard for a person to feel as though, one, they contribute, but two, that they feel a part of their local community, that they feel related to others, that they feel part of society. When that isolation, there we go, there's the dog, when that isolation starts to come in, that person's social network can get smaller, their confidence in themselves can become smaller, and their engagement in learning about things, finding that information that they need at the right time, when they need it, starts to lessen. And one example or several examples that I've seen recently, and I relate this in particular to falls as an example. So for individuals that have fallen over, it could be that someone may have had a fall and as a result of that fall may have had an injury, may have been in hospital, may as a result start to receive care from a loved one or from a carer, so to speak. But their confidence in their own physical capability as a result of perhaps an injury, could be a hip fracture, leads them down a path where they start to go out less, start to see friends less, and their situation becomes more isolated, meaning that they begin to lose more control of their life. And often it leads to more pressure on finances because they're having to spend more money on means to look after themselves rather than being able to take control of themselves, take control of their situation, let's say. Obviously referencing on the pressures on finance and, again, being able to control their own life. So touching on all of that, one of the big things around local area coordination is being able to support someone to become independent. The idea being that they can be introduced into the service, Now, for eligibility for local area coordination, it's essentially anybody who lives in the Derby city, so that's why I made particular reference to all of the wards, except additionally for the South Derbyshire areas that I've already referenced earlier, so Willington, Hilton and Melbourne, and of course the Mersey Marina as well. It's essentially any age, but if it were for somebody who were younger than, let's say, 14, we'd more than likely be introduced to an individual, or the individual, the parent, in terms of supporting the child at that stage. Because of the type of work that local area coordination has done in the past, the majority of individuals that we have, of course, been introduced to are those that have had disabilities, are generally in the 50+ bracket. That's the majority of population. However, in the last 5 years or so, there's been a much greater increase into those that are working, maybe even single parent, etc., that are trying to build a better life for themselves, navigate local services, and take control of their own life, essentially. The main idea is that it's not a limited time frame. So if a person's introduced to a local area coordinator as well, there's no time frame on that. It's not 6 weeks, it's not 8 weeks. It will take as long as it takes. They would be introduced, and the individual and their local area coordinator would create something that we call a shared agreement or shared vision, which is essentially almost an agreed plan together that's based on what that person wants, taking into account the bigger picture. The local area coordinator would be essentially looking to ask the right kind of questions to consider the wider life of that person. So it could be around relationships, finances, it could be around health, welfare, it could be around an awful lot of things, essentially, for them as an individual. So it's not just wholly expectant to outputs or expectations from services around, housing or social care or anything like that. It could be that the person simply wants to get more involved in their local community and doesn't really know how to go about doing it, doesn't know what local groups are in their area or where they might go to find out about that as well. It's a voluntary relationship. So as I mentioned, we take introductions, not referrals. So the whole point is that the individual has consented. We're not a statutory service. I never get that word right. We're not a statutory service. So there's no expectation that the individual has to work with us. It's entirely their choice. They do so because the individual themselves has hopefully made an informed decision based on beginning to understand what local area coordination is about, or because one of the various services that may have come into contact with them for one reason or another has given them hopefully a good understanding about what's on offer in terms of being introduced to their LAC for their area. And they, of course, from there look to make an informed decision and say, actually, I would like to have someone to talk to. We've received introductions from a wide range of areas: GP, social care, mental health, fire service, other services, so police, schools, as well as from the community. So it could be from community groups, it could be friends of a person, it could be the person themselves. And that's been the case for a good 5 to 10 years now. It's well established as a network in Derby. It's well established as a working practice in Derby. And generally now you will go from place to place, and not too often will you meet somebody that hasn't heard of local area coordination in Derby. In terms of, and I'm just going to touch now actually on introductions and referrals, why we make a point of doing that. The purpose of local area coordination is that the individual is introduced to the local area coordinator or LAC, and it's an introduction. So the person and the LAC are on an even wavelength. The term referral has connotations of an authoritative stance, so to speak. So a doctor would refer someone to a specialist for support. The individual would then essentially go to that person, and it would feel in more of an authoritative stance, in that the person's going to give them or prescribe them with advice based on the information that the individual gives to them. The idea of the introduction is that they're on an even wavelength, they're looking to build a trusting relationship together, and that the individual is their own professional in their own life. So for example, an LAC may come with all the information in the world, and myself and various colleagues have got all forms of different professional backgrounds, from working in the children's and youth services, drug and alcohol services. I myself was based in physical activity and nutrition. So there's a range of previous skills essentially that an LAC brings to the table, yes, as an individual, but it's taken into account that that person is the professional in their own life. They're the leader of their own story and it's their life. The idea being that the LAC is kind of along for the ride for this period of time. They're sitting with them in the passenger seat, so to speak, and the individuals making their own decisions based on neutral information that may be given at any stage from the LAC. In terms of that relationship together, so what we really hope to achieve is we look to try and help people to build and pursue their own personal vision for a good life. So I've mentioned the word good life a few times. And it is genuinely that the first question essentially that an LAC will ask a person is what would a good life look like for you? Which even to this day, whenever I've asked it, and when I was doing the role for three and a half, 4 years, it does tend to shock people. Because often people get asked very direct questions about very direct things and they're introduced directly to a service for a very specific thing. If it's housing, if it's finance, if it's debt, if it's to stop smoking, if it's to look into weight management, all these different things. Let's say if it's something to do with a GP appointment, it's very specific. So to have someone turn around to you and go, what does a good life look like? Suddenly their kind of thought process goes like this. And being around to being part of that is a huge privilege for any individual because you really get to know them and you really get to support them and be a soundboard essentially, someone for them to talk to, someone to ask the right questions at the right time so that they can come to their own conclusions themselves. The idea being that you'd support a person to feel strong, to feel safe and connected, and hopefully look to contribute themselves as a citizen within the local area. Supporting people in terms of finding practical non-service solutions to problems wherever possible. So a number of people will be introduced to a local area coordinator that will have all kinds of ranging concerns, issues, situations, and it's essentially trying to help them figure out the situation as best to them, because the system as it currently sits is set up with criteria, various guidelines, and no person's situation is ever going to be wholly the same as another. So whilst we have a number of tick boxes for things for people to receive, whether it be benefits or some form of support, no one's ever going to perfectly fit them. So having somebody to operate and support them in the little bits in the grey can go a long way, I've found over the years. So the idea again being to build more welcoming, inclusive and supportive communities. So in terms of an LAC, I haven't touched on this too much actually yet. The LAC would be, yes, working with individuals on a one-to-one basis, but they're based in the communities. They will be going to local coffee mornings. They will be going to local community meetings, local community groups, activities, meeting local volunteers, building up a rapport with them, getting to know them so that when they meet an individual who may be interested in going to a local coffee morning or a local grow your own kind of vegetable group, let's say, for volunteering, they know that person. They can introduce the individual to the person that leads it or to individuals there and perhaps even go along with them to the first few to help build that confidence. They're an active, involved person within their community. And in terms of the local area coordinators in our team, bar I think one person, everybody has been working within their community now for over 2.5 years and have begun to have real roots within that community and are well known. A key part of local area coordination is reducing dependency. So where people have had to lean on ongoing support through services, where maybe in some situations had they had the opportunity to consider a bigger picture, they might not need to. So helping them to take control of that support and need less of it, which of course supports services and creates more support for those that may need it further on down the line. I already mentioned this in terms of a question. So often many people will be met with a typical kind of question around what services and money do you need and how can I find them for you? That kind of you said we did approach in many ways. In terms of the LAC style, the idea is to ask what would a good life look like for you and how can we get there, and exploring that with the individual. Again, it's touching back on something I mentioned earlier. It's the shared agreement or shared vision, and it's opening up a bigger conversation to discuss all the things that matter to that person and why, and how that we could go about together in building that life that they want to try and live. This is a little bit of a model to kind of discuss, and I have an example case study that I'm going to try and blast through because I'm also conscious I've been talking for a good 17 minutes now, actually. So if in terms of a continued circle with an individual, let's say, and 8 kind of clear steps that may take place or would likely take place with an individual, they would be introduced to an LAC, and it could be that it's self-referral or self-introduction rather, or self-introduction, or sorry, introduction from other services, mental health, GP, wherever it comes from. Again, the individual would have given consent. They would sit down with their LAC and look to build that vision together. That vision initially is really important because it helps the LAC understand their situation as a whole. And they'll take the time out to do that. That's the main part and a clear part of our service, because without building that level of understanding and trust, things get a lot harder down the line, because in order for someone to wholly be able to tell you about their situation, they've got to build that trusting relationship with you. In doing that, they'll learn about the individual strengths, their skills. It could be that they really enjoy crafts. It could be that they themselves are a bit of a tech person and really enjoy utilizing the internet and would look to try and maybe use some of those skills for volunteering. It could be that they are an individual who is a socialite who is really keen on speaking to other individuals, but because of life changes that have come about, perhaps I've mentioned in terms of a fall, perhaps, that their life has changed quite drastically, and actually they're trying to reconfigure and use their strengths in order to get back out to the community and meet others. They'll look for information together, so that's the third aspect, and the LAC will look to provide some information in doing so as well. Accessible information, information that's useful to them, and the LAC in doing that will look in terms of asking them the right questions to help draw that out. They'll look at improving networks together. So it might be that old relationships with family or friends maybe look to re-establish, rekindled, in terms of being that soundboard, discussing relationships and considering how they might move forward. Or it could be building relationships in terms of local groups or organisations, coffee mornings, support groups in terms of carers, let's say, or it could be local services or places to go to get the right information, local information hubs, libraries, community centres, etc., where they'd look to introduce that person into, so that they themselves can empower themselves and know where to get that information in the future, so that they're not always looking for someone else to help them in doing it. They'd look at supporting the person to have their own voice and advocate for them in situations where they either don't feel confident to do it themselves or aren't in a position to do so. They create an action plan together, or an action together. The idea being that these are all the things that I want to achieve towards that good life that I want to have. Here's all the information and my strengths and my networks that I'm now starting to build up, and I'm now starting to speak for myself. We're beginning to take action, and what now can I look to do in terms of perhaps even contributing to my local community, if that's something that's important to them. The entire process is driven by them. Finally, the last part is around services. And you'll notice that services is the last one on this. The idea being here that the services are the backstop, not the front door, so that individuals don't feel as though they have to constantly try and get hold of services for that support, so that they don't feel as though that they are having to wait for someone else to help figure out their life. The idea being that we are supporting them to be empowered themselves, to use their own strengths, networks, and create their own community if needs be as well, in order to support themselves moving forward. And I guess it kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier of the LAC being a soundboard, asking the right questions, and supporting that person to become more independent, really. That's the whole point of the role. Never looking to take charge, never looking to dictate what a person's life could, would, or should be. It's entirely around their view, their thought, their perspective. Only should a safeguarding concern come up would that ever be the case or ever change. And one thing I haven't mentioned is that all information shared between LAC and the individual is kept completely between them, unless, again, as I say, some kind of safeguarding concern were ever brought forward. Just blasting through a quick case study. So just to give a bit of an idea. So a lady named Mela was essentially introduced to an LAC within the Derbyshire, South Derbyshire area. And a number of things essentially took place alongside Meryl to help her build that good life. So when she was originally presented or introduced to the LAC, Meryl hadn't got much of a social connection. She had issues with her knee, and she had a number of complex concerns and issues that meant that she was in a lot of pain and struggling to get from place to place. She didn't have much community connection in her area. She actually lived on a boat within the Mercia Marina area. She had several family members that weren't necessarily too close by. They weren't necessarily on close enough talking terms that Meryl felt confident enough to engage in discussion around what a good life would look like or what support that she might need. She was very much of an individual who would kind of allow life to become harder for her and not bother other people because she felt more uncomfortable about the idea of someone being put out to support her, and would therefore go about her life accepting more and more and more, and with things becoming harder and harder as a result. So after meeting the LAC for the area, getting to know one another, building that trusting relationship together, they created that shared agreement, shared vision that essentially led to Meryl building local connections with groups within the area, which then eventually led to Meryl being able to travel to the groups independently because that was an issue for her. She eventually, through support of navigation of the services, ended up having a knee operation and was connected to a GP at a complex needs service, or through the complex needs service, which is a service designed to support people with a number of a range of issues that she was referred into for extra support. She had extra support from her daughters, which the relationship was kind of rekindled really, and she began to feel and grow in more confidence to have conversations with them around her struggles, her wants, her needs, her desires, and how they might be able to support her because they really wanted to as well. And that eventually culminated in the boats being decluttered because there was issues around falls for Meryl in this instance, and the installation of grab rails from a community volunteer service that the local area coordinator knew through their links within the community. She also was able to apply for social housing with support of the LAC. Again, Meryl leading on this, doing this herself, just the LAC alongside her, helping with some parts of the paperwork, but not leading on it. Meryl did this all for herself. The application was eventually accepted, and she moved into a bungalow and eventually worked out PIP and PIP reviews and set up her own utility bills at this point. And actually, at this stage, is happily living in her new home. It was important for her because she'd had regular falls on the boat. And that's what a good life looked like for her. For her personal view, she wanted to find somewhere that she could age and live well, age well in. And obviously living on a boat isn't always the best situation for some, dependent on their physical capabilities. So that's an example of the community coming in, being introduced to local community, building relationships with family, navigating the local services in the area to get the right level of support to help Meryl manage her pain and build that good life that I spoke of as an example earlier. I just wanted to show a few pictures of an example. So LACs will be involved with various coffee morning groups or various groups that exist. So Nadine, I know, is closely linked with Mickleover Carers Group. This is Mickleover Carers Group. I'm just referencing that as an example. This is a local group that's actually based in Alveston, and it's a local coffee morning group that's supported by one of our colleagues named Catherine. This is one that's based in, it's called the Tranquility Cafe, based in Littleover. With local area coordination, we've been able to evidence that there increased value for informal and supportive relationships, including reducing isolation, increasing capacity of families to continue in caring roles, improved access to information, which is a real key factor, better resource communities. That's around bringing people together. Example, so because of the being able to bring those services together as a voluntary sector and a community group, they're able to support one another as things come up. Supporting people into volunteering, training and employment, preventing crisis through early intervention, so being introduced to somebody before things get worse, because that's a real key thing, especially nowadays. All too often, people's situation only tends to meet the criteria when they're in a crisis situation. So being able to support them before it hits that is extremely important, not just for them, but also for the systems around them as well. And changing the balance of care to the use of more informal supports and diverting people from the formal services, i.e. changing that front door view, because we're in a situation now, I'll go for the example of GPs, where many individuals will be unwell and look to call their GP because there isn't necessarily that wealth of information that's on offer. And we try and support in doing that one-to-one with individuals and within community groups. Just a little bit of additional information. So this comes back to the community example. We, our team are actually holding and I mentioned because it's obviously a carers group, essentially this, we will be holding as part of our regular monthly sessions or support groups, drop-in sessions rather, Micklover Cares. It takes place at Micklover Library. And our next one is actually based around Parkinson support. And there's a wealth of partners that we have that will be coming down to give advice, information, signpost towards a local support group, so Micklover Carers Group, which I imagine there's a high likelihood that's not an unknown name within this group here today. But it's completely free. As I say, it's drop-in. It's 1 till 3 p.m. on the 24th of February, and all are welcome to come down. And finally, I'll share these slides, but in terms of the local area coordinators, who they are and where they are, we have a web page that has actually the whole neighbourhood service on it, because there's a whole other part of the service I haven't really discussed, trying to keep things nice and focused on this. But we have the neighbourhood service, and it includes everybody in it, what ward they are based in, a contact number, a face so you know who it is, and an email address as well, which I'll send over to Nikki to happily share out for anyone should they wish to get in contact with their local area coordinator or myself or anybody based within the teams that are perhaps in their ward that they live in. And thank you for listening to me. I went a little bit over the time that I think I was allotted, but hopefully it was useful.
Okay, that's loads of information. Thank you. So there are a few questions that have come up in the chat. One was really quite closely related to the last slide you had up about who the local area coordinators are and where they are. One of our staff was trying to find which local area coordinator covered an area for a client recently. And although she looked on the list, her geographical knowledge and the carer's geographical knowledge meant that she didn't know which one it was. Is there a tool where you can put in postcodes, or is there anything like that that makes it easier?
We have a tool. Unfortunately, we're not allowed to share that tool. But that said, we do have, and I'll share this as well, we have a local area coordination email address, just to send it to that as an example if you're not sure. But to be quite honest, if you're not sure, but you've got a rough idea of the whereabouts and you emailed the LAC or even called them, even if you're wrong, they'll happily introduce to the right LAC. Just because what I would always recommend, though, just touching on that, is certainly if it's professional or for anyone, frankly, but I would always recommend calling the LAC where possible anyway, because if you're looking to call them about an individual that you want to introduce, to give them a little bit of an idea about that person, obviously in form of consent. The only small things that we kind of, in terms of a referral or introduction, ask for is their, basic information in terms of postcode, let's say, and a contact number. And if there is any safeguarding concerns, then yeah, let us know that. That's an aside conversation that we would probably look to have, via a phone call, let's say. But it wouldn't be, Nikki, genuinely, if you were looking to introduce somebody to an LAC in any area of Derby, and you're not sure, just getting in contact with any one of us, you'd find them, just through speaking to someone in the end.
I was going to say the fact that I've had various calls of people wanting to get hold of LACs, and I've shared that information to people. Okay, so thanks, Nadine. There's a first-hand knowledge from somebody that is actually working as an LAC, which is really useful. Thanks. So the next question is, hang on, let me find it.
We have carers who are isolated and would like to attend our events, but are held back by anxiety of attending the initial session. Can an LAC help with that issue?
Would you like me to answer this, Danny?
Yeah, you go for it, actually. I want mine because my voice got a bit sore, I'll be honest. Thank you.
Yes. Obviously, all areas in the city are different, and I suppose it depends on capacity. But majority of LACs that I come across, if we are available, we can meet somebody. Like, I'll give an example for myself, where I've met somebody outside of a group, to reduce that feeling of anxiety. Met them outside, walked in with them, and introduced them to other residents. And from there, to be honest, from meeting other people, that's it. They've gone. They don't need to speak to me again. I'm literally asking them halfway through the session, "Are you okay?" And they're fine, because the groups that they've been introduced to have made them very welcoming. Also, as well, depending on what group they're going to, I might say to the lead volunteer, "I'm going to be bringing somebody in today," so they're aware that person's going to be attending, which is also very, very good for that person, because they're ready for that person and they're welcoming. So for me, from my experience, I will meet that person. I won't go and pick them up, but I will meet them outside of the venue, and walk in with them. And a lot of the times that helps with their anxiety. I also sit with them. It all depends on the person. Sometimes they want me to sit with them and introduce them to people, or they just literally just need me to just walk in with them and introduce them that way.
Actually, you've made me think of an example, Dean, because I'm just going to add to that, if that's all right, because often, and this will be the case, we'll have colleagues that from anywhere as well will drop an email, because obviously local area coordinators are based, or LACs are based in communities. They'll know of various groups, activity providers, etc. And you'll often get the odd email where someone will say, I've been recently speaking to somebody who's interested in getting out to maybe look at going to a local coffee morning. They have a bit of nervousness or anxiety, etc. They've been isolated for a while. Could you please just send me a list of local warm spaces or local coffee mornings or activity groups, etc. And often the LAC may push back and say it's not quite what we're for, or it's not quite what we would like to do in the situation. And they may even ask to be introduced to the person, mainly because there's a reason why that person hasn't attended them. And it's often the case, I think you gave the example there, Nikki, where somebody has anxiety and worries around being introduced. It's kind of what Nadine's touched on in terms of it depends. So being introduced to that person and getting to understand their anxieties and the bigger picture. So it's not just about taking them to that local group, because the chances are that there's more going on that's worrying them, that's making them leading to them having those anxieties, etc. That then means that's why they're not necessarily attending that group. So the LAC would look to go and meet them, get to know them, understand them more, understand what they'd like as a good life again. So it becomes more than just about the local community group activity. Essentially.
Sorry, Danny and everybody. I'd read that wrong. I thought you meant an actual introduction. So yeah, sorry.
Oh no, yes,
thanks for that.
you were right.
Thanks
You're
for
still
Danny.
Right,
Thank you for putting that bit in. Sorry.
No, you're still right anyway. I think it's just giving an example.
I think it's really nice to hear that you're not, obviously from our end, the symptom is not wanting to come to the group. From your end, there's a root cause for that, and it's the LAC's job to kind of uncover that and work on those deeper levels or wider levels with that person for that good life. And so I guess from both of your answers about, yes, practically, if I am working with someone and their nervousness is around this, I can help and support that. But also as an LAC, you would look deeper and wider to make sure that whatever had created that behaviour was addressed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sound okay? So there's a question about the introductions, because I think that they can potentially be a little bit more involved than just saying our helpline staff may talk to a carer on the phone, and that carer, and they might think, oh, this person would be a really, really lovely person to be able to work with local area coordinators, and they may get the consent from that. But and hopefully after today, the helpliners will feel a little bit more empowered to have those conversations about what that looks like. But would you prefer the helpline colleagues and our staff to do something along the lines of an urging them along, giving them the details and signposting, or to be more active in that introduction process?
So in terms of more active, do you mean what would the example be of more active? Do you mean
well, we'd heard previously about there being kind of a handover with more information.
So like a phone call to the LAC rather than an email. Do you mean in that example? Yeah. So I'm just making sure I was on the right wavelength. Sorry. I would always say, and we would always definitely say, an introduction to someone is an introduction. It's the time and care taken to kind of give the bit of a understanding around that person and their life and their view, so that as an example, it helps, because I'll give an example. So sometimes colleagues from various other areas within the council can, and it could even be, I'll give, again, this could be a harsh example, but it could be housing. Somebody could come to a colleague with a desire to move house or apply within the housing, apply for a new housing association, let's say, or housing situation. But they could also tell them a number of other things specifically that kind of are important to them in their life. It could be that they are in debt. It could be that they haven't got good relationships with their family. Maybe that they are struggling to make ends meet, and maybe on the breadline, let's say. It could be a number of different things. What is then really important is that information is given to a certain level to the LAC to give them a bit of an idea when they make that phone call to that person. Because what can then be the case is if the LAC calls and they've only had a short email with a short, like a couple of sentences that just says, "Oh, this person wants to apply for new housing association, or wants help with navigating certain things," that person then gets this predetermined view that I'm there to help them with their PIP application or their housing application, very specific things. And it's a bigger relationship than that. And it also can give them a view that we're going to sit and physically do that for them as well. So I would definitely say the most important, the best way of doing a good introduction is to, again, get to know that person an amount on the phone, which it sounds like that's the case, Nikki, and probably look at giving the LAC a call. And if not possible, I'd certainly drop them an email with the key information, but look to have some form of conversation with them about that person, because it will only help that introduction. It'll only help the first conversation that takes place. It can be really challenging for an individual when professional calls them and starts talking to them about something and they don't really understand what they're talking about. And we can often get examples where someone may be struggling, and especially when it comes to care, they may be just starting to fall into that situation where or not fall, but progress into that situation where they need care, maybe on the verge of crisis dependent on their situation. And suddenly every single service gets pulled in, and perhaps a colleague has sat there and they ask the question of, well, could I signpost you to services to support you? And then suddenly they get 10 or 15 phone calls from the local GP, the social prescriber, the LAC, the adult social care support, carer support in whatever way, the local volunteer that's part of Good Neighbours, Disability Direct, because they want to help. And suddenly they get this influx of phone calls, and all they've kind of turned around to the person and said is, I just want some help with 2 or 3 particular things. And that suddenly a flood of phone calls have come in. So it's really important that they understand and give consent to being introduced to the LAC, and in the knowledge that there's a wider conversation that can and will take place if they want it to, with them. It's quite a long description I've given there, but I guess it's trying to really give the context of what is on offer, and that it's not a simple yes or no criteria in any way. It's very much a yes. It's just helping someone to make that informed decision the best way they can.
Thank you. That answers that really well. I think it is a difficult line for us to tread, because like you say, when somebody is potentially close to crisis, everybody wheels in, and that's the right thing to do, but also can be overwhelming for the carer who may not remember one terminology or one acronym from the next.
And you know, saying that, Nikki, sometimes it's also not ideal for the LAC to be involved. So we are mainly a preventative program. That's the idea. So if they are really towards the crisis, then it is the crisis teams they should go to. At which point, once they come out the other end and they're beginning to be in a more balanced situation where they can begin to look at their bigger picture out of the crisis, that's when they would probably be introduced to the LAC. So it might be that if you, I don't know how long your contact stays with them, but if you were in contact with them for that period and you were back in contact with them again, that would be the time probably when to introduce them. It's either in a good time frame before perceived crisis or just after. But if you know in that conversation that you perceive they are in a crisis point, LAC is not for them. They need the right services at that point, I would say.
Helpful, thank you. So you talked a little bit about the confidentiality that the LAC will have with the person they're working with. And obviously, when we hear a lot about people having to repeat their stories. So if you're working with someone who really struggles to repeat their story, and you've got to that point where you think other professionals or other services might be involved, how do you overcome that confidentiality?
In terms of when you say confident, so for example, when you are wanting to introduce to an LAC and you and as an individual wanting to introduce, is that what you mean, Nikki? Sorry.
Or when the LAC wants to introduce to somebody else or wants to refer on to somebody else, do you have a system? Because if they don't have any notes, if there's no record.
So we always look to get permission from the person, and we always ask that permission's had from the person. We would always, if ever we are contacted from other services wanting information, we will always ask for permission. That's a non-negotiable with us, because unless it's absolute safeguarding, in which case we would go to them. It's a non-negotiable because, for one, we're not a statutory service, so it's part of our values and principles that we stick with that person. We are that trusted person, that confidant of theirs, so we don't just share info unless we've agreed with them that they're okay previously with us doing that, or unless they've asked us to advocate for them in some way, shape or form, and it's agreed between us so that it's not becoming a dependency, so to speak. But it's certainly a non-negotiable that we wouldn't share. We'd be encouraging them to take charge themselves on their own situation to the best of their capability. If, for example, it's a case of them trying to grow confidence to do that, then that would be a big part of that shared agreement, shared vision together, whereby we're kind of talking through tools, signposting towards training opportunities, courses for them to be their own advocate, empower themselves, so that individuals or other services or other colleagues aren't having to do the talking for them, and thereby reducing that need for confidentiality in the first place. That would be the main. I'm hoping I've answered the twofold there. If there's any part I haven't.
No, that sounds good. Thank you. That's complete. Yeah, you went both. It's great. So that's really all the questions we have. I think there's probably points for discussion with the helpline staff separately, but that as far I think. Oh no, hang on a minute. We've just got somebody leaving. That's all. So those are all the questions that we've got. Unless somebody comes in on the last minute question, we can probably switch off the recording. So thank you very much for your time, both of you, Nadine and Danny. Hopefully this is going to be really something very useful for carers going forward, and it'll be stored on our resource library. But Alice, do you want to switch off the recording?